Welcome back. We are on week 3 of John and T Squared. I'm John Colemorgan, coming from Buckinghamshire in England. I'm joined by the gorgeous Tracy Bouras. Tracy, hello.
Hello, John. How are you today?
Not too bad. How's Cape Town?
Marvelous, just marvelous.
Wonderful. And you're in the height of summer, you lucky lady. Unlike Tracy Arnet, who is joining us from Canada. Hello, Tracy.
Hello, how are you?
Well, I think we're a little warmer than you are, aren't we?
Yes, we're in the height of winter here.
But Canadian winters are not something to sneeze at, that's for sure.
This is true.
So, ladies, we are going to do a difficult podcast today. We're going to talk about the things we don't like about quilting. Bom, bom, bom. And I want to be clear to anybody who's joining in and listening to us now, we may have things we don't like about quilting, but we still do so much quilting. We don't care that much about the bad things. We're still doing all the good things. And at the moment, I am channeling that Tracy Bouras, who is the most positive human being I've ever met in my life. And I think that's something that she would have said. Is that right, Tracy B?
Oh, dear, John. I think you need to meet more people if I'm the most positive person you've met. Oh, dear. Yeah, I would definitely agree. I think there's always a lesson, not a lesson, but there's always something to be learned. And so, like, when our feathers get ruffled by whatever it is, there's maybe another reason behind that. Yeah, I just try and look at it from maybe another point of view. I always feel like when you're dealing with people, everyone's different, and there was always the mother that loved that person at some point. So I try and see the love.
Well, not in all cases. Sorry, I had to get that in before my mother got a little prop there. We're not going
to. People have daddy issues. I didn't realize that you'd have mommy issues.
Oh God, no, she's a miserable woman. But anyway, that is a different story. That's a podcast all on its own.
John, at some point, she loved you.
Well,
that's all I'm going to say.
We'll leave
Doesn't
that
matter
there.
how long it was.
Don't write in and tell me if you did.
Oh dear. Okay, next subject. No, same subject, different. Tracy A, your turn.
Oh, I'm still trying to catch up to what you guys are talking about. Yeah, there isn't much negative for me in the quilting, except I usually, when I have a really good run and my points are matching and everything, I look down and I have no bobbin thread.
Yep. I think bobbin is definitely the top leader of my hate of quilting.
Yeah, and it's the perfect run.
Yep.
Yeah. So
it's that false sense of confidence that you have that everything's going your way.
Yeah. So I guess the lesson is before you start, check your bobbin thread. Yep. But we never do. Or I need a machine that has low bobbin thread, flashy button maybe. That should be patterned.
I was busy making a new shop sample for a new pattern that I was doing, and it was FPP, and exactly the same thing I had stitched together, maybe because I try and chain piece them all and do as many at once.
Yes.
So I've got 45 blocks I've got to make, but I'm doing 2 in the demo, so I had 36 or 37 of these blocks, and 31 of them had no bobbin. Devastating. So annoying. But anyway, on we plod.
So then you get up, go and pour yourself a gin and tonic, go back, and then start again. So.
Oh no, I find it's better to just walk away for an hour or two. It's just easier.
Well, you have a gin or two. Yeah.
But I'm more of a grumpy person than most people are. So
no, really, honestly, it's the little things like not have enough pressure on your ruler when you go to cut, and it moves that last 6 inches and it goes either cut too short or it goes too big, and you have to just little things like that are just more annoying than anything. It's not really a downfall.
Well, I do think one of the things that there aren't any tutorials on how you actually cut fabric. And that's one of the things I'm working on at the moment, is that I think there isn't really a resource that you go to as a beginner and
No.
go to and say, right, if you buy this ruler, this is what it will do. I bought this ruler and never used it. I'm not slagging the company off. I've just never used it.
Right.
I think things like that, it's that there's a big hole in the market for complete and utter beginners.
Yeah, and there's a difference between cutting like the full width of your fabric with a long 24.5-inch ruler, as if you fold it again and you cut with like say a 12 or 18-inch ruler, you have more control. So there's lots of little tricks and things like that, but nobody, those aren't really explained when you buy fabric or you're a newbie. You have to learn on your own, or someone shows you, or
You see, for me, the other disadvantage is that fabric shops are failing left and right. And in the UK, in my area, where there used to be sort of 10, 15 fabric shops, now there are 3 or 4. And people don't have the time to sit and help people by showing them. And when you do run a class for it, they aren't really well subscribed in the first place for people to learn. So it's a very hard balancing act to try and find that perfect niche of being able to provide the service and it be taken up and be something that can continue.
And I think that you've hit something on that a basic quilting class should start from the bottom floor, and you learn how to fold the fabric to cut it, how to use the ruler, where to put the pressure and things like that. Like right from the ground up, there should be something.
No, I agree with you.
I gotta say, the only people that are going to watch those videos is maybe someone that's made a quilt and wasn't happy with the results and then needs to go back and look at that. Because I don't know about you, but if I start something new and I just want to get going, like I wouldn't sit and watch a whole video on how to fold the fabric. Those videos will be something that are watched when you've made a mistake, not at the very start of something. So I think that's an interesting thing. I mean, there's still things, I mean, I still get horrible wobbles sometimes in my folds. I'm like, no, I should be doing this a little better, but I'm like, I gotta get going. So I just cut and hope for the best afterwards. But I mean, I've been doing this for a while, so
I think you've actually fed into something really well there, because for me, I don't really mind if I've got a wobble in my fabric. I don't really mind if I've missed a point, because I've made a quilt and I love the quilt, and I don't care if you don't love the quilt. I love it. That's what's important to me. But I think it's really disparaging sometimes that there are people who, when they see a beginner's first quilt, that they recoil and they get that top lip moving and they're like, oh, is that what you made? As you can tell, I'm quoting. And I just find that that's quite hard for a beginner, because they have literally, they loved it and they really are excited and they think it's terrible. Even as the most experienced quilter, everything you make you think is terrible, and you don't need anybody affirming that for you. And I think we just need to be a little kinder in our approaches to people, because even if they are out by ½ an inch on the quilt, like the number of quilts I've had in, and it's not by any malice that people have done it, that I had one quilt that was 6 inches longer on one end than it was on the other. Now, I'm not going to go and tell the person that they're a terrible quilter or anything, because they're not. It's just a case that their measurements were off and they were a little bit longer on one side, and they love it and I make it work. And it's a bit weird when you quilt it and it looks a bit strange. But you try and offset that by starting 3 inches above and 3 inches below on the thing and just try and ease it in. There are ways of doing it without making people feel bad.
What I was talking about is the person that's never worked with fabric, has no idea, but wants to learn, like wants to start and make that first quilt or that first baby blanket or something, that has no idea how fabric stretches or moves, or the tactileness of it. Like, so that's where I was thinking there's a gap in the out there for these people that have never been around fabric at all. I don't have a problem if I'm out by ½ an inch or something like that, or when my ruler moves, I know what I did wrong and it's a little inconvenience. That's where I was thinking. So, but for the totally, absolutely new beginner, until you've touched fabric and cut it and worked with it and sewn on the bias or something, you don't really understand. Maybe that's a little too harsh a word. You don't
You don't recognize what it is that's
Thank
gone
you.
wrong. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
I will
Yeah.
say one thing you've touched on there was bias and warp and weft and things like that. I've been quilting for about 2 or 3 years at the point that I went to a class with Jenny Raymond. And Jenny Raymond, if anybody hasn't met her or knows about her, she is a force of nature and one of the most amazing humans I've ever met. Love that woman to pieces. But literally, she sat down and she looked at me and she said, "What are you doing?" It was like your Roly moment a few podcasts ago. And she said, "What are you doing?" And I said to her, "I'm cutting my fabric." She says, "But now you're going to be on the bias." And I looked at her and said, "What does that mean?" And she sat there and she explained to me what bias was in about 4 sentences. And all of the errors of my quilting up to that point were explained by those 4 sentences. And all it was that instead of cutting on the straight grain, I was cutting on the diagonal. So all of my points stretched. And it was something so simple like that. And you just think, oh, light bulb moment, light bulb moment.
Exactly. So I think when they say a beginner quilting class, it really does need to be a beginner class from the how, come, and why.
It's almost like a beginner's quilting class, but you're not going to sew anything.
Yeah. Well, and there's the other ones too that want to make a quilt, but they've never touched a sewing machine.
Yeah.
So they're expected to know how to sit down and work a sewing machine. Well, if you never thread and you never sewn, you don't know how to move the fabric or drive the fabric through the machine. So you're not going to be happy. Like, I think for some, that would be a real turning point where they love it or hate it. And so there's a little bit more, I think, that needs to be education for the beginner per se to learn to know how to, if they want to progress. Because it is an expensive hobby to get into it. So,
it is.
you know, if they have the basics, then it might make it easier.
No, I agree.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know if in South Africa, when I was at school a long time ago, they always had home economics, which included cooking and sewing. And those sort of subjects have all sort of fallen away. So when you were at school, you had one subject where the boys did woodwork and the girls did sewing. So at that point, there was always some sort of, you knew what a sewing machine was and you kind of had an idea of how it all kind of worked to a degree. And so you either liked doing it or you didn't. But I think now there isn't much of that. But I think at the advent of COVID, people sort of hauled out their sewing machines and like, hey, we can do a mask. And then the interest in that sort of increased. So very interesting how times have changed.
As an example of that, one of the ladies in my shop, Faith, she dropped me a message because of the Tilda embroidery quilt. Now that is a quilt that was done for the kit that we did, was done on Vlieselina quilters grid. And she messaged me and she said, "Do you think I can do this as a beginner?" And I won't deny it. I said, look, it's not, as long as you understand the concept of how to use quilters grid, all you're doing is quilting by numbers, that you're putting all these different grids in at the same time, all these different pieces of fabric you're putting in the right place at the right time. So it's a bit like color by numbers, and then you're sewing on the line 1/4 of an inch. And as long as your 1/4 of an inch is the same, yes, you should in theory be able to do this. So she came and she ordered the fabric and she picked it up on the Tuesday. And on the following Wednesday, she arrived with a finished quilt top.
Oh, wow.
And she's working on a 34-year-old sewing machine. It's a little faff that works brilliantly. 34 years, this had sat there and she'd done the odd curtain hem or thing like that. And she made this quilt top and said, actually, I want to put some borders on it. I want to create my own design on the borders or down the side because I need it to be a bit bigger. And she bought more fabric and she went off and designed this. And it was extraordinary to watch how she'd done that. And imagine now, and within 2 weeks, she'd made 4 more quilt tops. But imagine now a quilt shop owner had turned around and said, "You're a complete beginner. No, you couldn't do that." And this woman has created 4 of the most beautiful quilt tops, and they're really good. And it's not that just because she's a customer, I'm not say, yes, that's really good. They are really good. And her work is exceptional, and her 1/4 inch is brilliant. And just in the space of 2-3 weeks, she'd made these tops. And that just brought so much joy to my life, knowing that somebody had gotten inspired to do this, to make quilts and to do this. And she's now hooked. She's loving this. She made another one between Christmas and New Year, which I love. But I imagine she'd gone into a shop where someone had said, "No, you can't." And I think that's my dislike is, because there are unfortunately grumpier people in the world who aren't as encouraging. And I think that's a little bit sad.
Well, it's brilliant that you found your quilt shop, John. I mean, isn't that just the perfect way? It all works out.
It's just so inspiring when you see somebody new coming along. Because when we started quilting, we had that little light in our eyes could not burn brighter about the joy of something that we'd found to do that we could make. And I think sometimes that, that however hard our days are, finding that joy of quilting, you lose it every now and then, and you lose the sojo, for the want of a better word. And I think it's just wonderful when people like that come along and they're able to reignite your own sojo.
It reinforces too why you do it, the joy of why you do it.
Exactly.
I met this wonderful woman through the store. Her name is Kathy, and she came in, her first quilt she'd ever was trying to make was for her daughter's wedding, king size, white on white with hand embroidery.
Oh my goodness.
And it was a quilt as you go. And I looked at this woman like, oh my gosh, like it was incredible. And she didn't have any qualm of the fact she couldn't do it. This is what she wanted to do. And it was amazing. And the quilt was out of this world for her first quilt, like amazing.
Oh, that's very special. But I do think as beginners, we need to just remind people you don't need to start with a king size quilt. You can start with a mug rug.
Yeah.
You can start with a table rug. You will love it just as much.
So,
Tracy, how big was your first quilt?
Well, like I said, when I first did the intro, I've always sort of tinkered. And believe it or not, there are two quilts they're baby quilts that my sister still has that I made. But they are, and they still, I mean, they're probably close to 25 years old, and they still, I mean, I hate to say that the dogs lie in them, but I'm good with that too. And they were poly cotton. I hand painted some of the blocks, little butterfly, hand painted with fabric paint, and I couldn't get the right colors, so I actually painted the fabric and then cut it up and then sewed it into a quilt. But it's
it's brilliant.
It's still going. I mean, not like, but some of it was poly cotton, but I didn't know any better. I didn't worry too much about it. I just sewed it and I hand quilted it. And it, like I said, it's still there and it's been washed a bazillion times. So I think it's just really important, if you are an experienced quilter, or even if you've just started this, to be not even encouraging, but everyone's in a different place in their life of where they begin with, and you always, you don't want to really compare yourself. But I think when there are just some people that will say, oh, I can never do anything like that, and those are the people that need some encouragement, and just to be shown how not how easy it is, but there's so many ways of quilting, whether you sew little blocks together or English paper piecing. Like, it's really, I think there's something for everyone. So if you love to sew at the machine, or if you love to sew by hand, or there's just so many different things that can excite you, and to every sort of skill level. And that's when I started doing my little kits. I thought, well, this is something nobody, you don't have to have anything. Everything is already done for you. It's like super duper easy. And that was just my way of trying to encourage people that you don't need a sewing machine. You can just sit down with a cup of coffee and make something sweet for somebody else. And that's kind of where my inspiration came from, because there are lots of young people that want to just do nice things for other people. And that was just, well, why would people want to quilt? You want to make something nice for somebody else.
People forget that when they do want to make something for you, they want to share a little bit of themselves with you. They want to share a little bit of the love of what they're enjoying with you, to be able to make something that you can tangibly know that you are loved. Because the one thing people forget is, when you actually break down how much it costs to make a quilt, oh my goodness. it's not a cheap hobby by any stretch of the imagination. One of the quilts I made recently, it took me about 45 hours just to make the quilt. And the fabric, it was probably, with the front and the back, you're probably looking at about £200, £220 worth of fabric. Then you got the wadding, which was another 50 quid, another 30 quid. So probably, it was probably about 40 quid. So you're at 260 plus 40 at 5 hours of work. So at £10 an hour, you're at £700. Then you've got to quilt it, and then the quilting of that's probably another £200. So you know you're knocking on the door of £600 to £800 to make a decent sized quilt for someone, if you were going to charge for it. And I think people forget that. And for me, it's not about the money of it. It's a case of the time and the love that you put into giving something like that. I don't know if people fully appreciate just what goes into it sometimes.
Especially if they've never sewn or made a handcraft, they have no idea. But someone that is crafty and that you've made, they do understand. But in any craft, I don't think you'll ever get your time worth.
Never.
In dollars. It just doesn't happen.
Definitely
because it just would make it too out of everyone's price range to purchase or something if you really charge what it was worth.
There's a woman in America, and I forget her name. She only does hand piecing, hand quilting. She does English paper piecing, and she charges about $25,000, $30,000 per quilt. And she only does 3 or 4 quilts a year. But she is booked up 5-10 years in advance because she has refused to cut her prices, and everybody can see the detail in the work that she does. And that's it. That's all she does. And she loves it. And she's fully booked for years in advance. And you just think, gosh, that's amazing.
That's incredible.
But I think that is also an awareness that that's one of the things I keep saying to people, like you can't undercharge for what you're doing or devalue what you've got. It's about educating people about the time and effort that goes into it. It's just a misconception about it being a hobby or like a sweet little craft that little old ladies do. And people don't bulk at a piece of furniture that they can pay like large sums of money, but a piece of furniture is just, for me, is just as of value as a quilt is. Like they last the same amount of time.
Exactly.
So I think it's just about bringing an awareness that it does have value. And I think until that is also by people doing too cheap is one of the ways that it undermines it all, that kind of thing.
And that's exactly the point, that you'll find one person will sell a quilt for 50 quid and it's handmade and hand quilted and beautiful, but they don't see the value in what they've done, that is now becoming a benchmark for it. And that just, I think it is one of my very favorite. She's a machine embroiderer. And she does the most fantastic embroidery, Suzanne Sketchley. She does an amazing collection of machine embroidery. But her pieces, when you try and buy them from her, and I know we are her friends, but she's nowhere not charging anywhere near what it was worth. She barely covers the cost of the stabilizers and the thread, let alone the time and all of that. So I think that is being able to value yourself enough to do that and not budge from it, because if one person doesn't buy it, somebody else will see the value and somebody else will buy it.
But it's also to find that market, because people that have never quilted or sewed or made something have no idea. So, and when you hear the word quilting, I think a lot of people just think it's putting squares together, but they don't realize like the hours in applique or paper piecing or your EPP, or like there's so many different varieties of quilting and how extensive it is, like we've already talked about, so it's hard to find that market.
It is.
Especially at a local level. Maybe online it might be different now because you have more exposure, but just say from years ago, just going like from local markets and things, people aren't going to pay $500-600 for a quilt that's been made, because they just don't. They compare it to something they can get at a local big store, for $40, and it's just not the same. They don't understand the difference.
And it was, as Tracy B was saying, you wouldn't mind paying that for a piece of furniture. But if we also look at how much people pay for a pair of shoes and for a handbag, you do think to yourself, gosh, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And and those are all mass produced. So yeah, I it's just a case of reiterating it and having. I don't even think it's a self-worth thing, because I think that's what a lot of artists suffer from. You know, they don't feel like their work is good enough. They don't, like, you know, the starving artist is always you know, they aren't able to charge enough for their work because they don't believe that it's
But
worth
even
that.
the most famous artists in the world, while they were alive, they were penniless. And it's only once they're dead that their art has become so well known.
Yeah.
I do think one of my biggest peeves is that we all need to stop going and pointing out the errors in our work. We need to stop saying, oh, it's not that good. Because yes, to you, you may not think it's that good, but when you show it to somebody else, their little world lights up. And by putting that little caveat on the end of your brilliance, I think is awful, because you dull that light for someone else. And I don't like that aspect of it.
I agree with you, John, completely. I mean, I always feel like you should treat yourself like you would your best friend. You would never, like, you know, if your best friend showed a quilt to you, you'd be like, oh, those don't look so good. Like, you need to be kind and gentle with yourself, because even though that is for you like a glaring error, someone else
9
will
times out of 10,
appreciate it.
nobody else notices it.
Nope. A friend of mine, you know, she loves to say a blind man running for his life wouldn't notice. So if that's if that's what you've got to go with, then
I love it.
I think you just you need to definitely be kinder on yourself, because you know that's something that's come from your hands. That, you know, if you didn't like the way that point turned out, the next time you make a quilt, you could do it better. Like, you know, that's the great thing with quilting. You learn something new. Next time around, you've always got the opportunity to do it differently or better if that's what you like. I mean, again, you know, I get to a point where you're saying, what are your pet peeves? Like, if you've sewn something and the points don't line up, and then you unpack it and you read it and it's still wrong, you're like, God damn it, like, that's a peeve for me. And then eventually just like, well, tough duties. Third time around, it's staying in that way. Like, that's just the end of it.
Well, just as a practical level, if you unpick fabric more than once, you've distorted it anyway. You're never going to hit your point.
Exactly.
And even if you unpick it the once with the bias, you may not hit the point anyway. So if you are going to redo it, go and get your fabric, cut a new one, and start again.
No, that sounds like too much like hard work for me. No,
well, I've never unpicked anything. I've just looked at it and go, and at this point, there is a point that's not been met. If you don't want to do that, don't do this. It's just, you've got to.
And my thought is too, if you give it to someone that's not a quilter, they're never going to know.
Exactly.
Yeah. So it's a win-win.
Yeah.
No, I agree. I think one other thing we're going to loosely touch on, because I want to do this as a podcast on its own at one point, is what do we feel about when we do make a quilt for somebody and they then use it differently to what you would have expected. Like, Tracy, you mentioned earlier that your first quilt is now being used by the dogs. You don't seem to care about that. Other quilters would go and rip that out of the box.
Listen, those dogs are so cute. It doesn't matter. Like,
but it's a big thing. It's a big thing. I don't
know. Well, the thing is that when you gift something to someone, you gotta let it go.
And that's the thing. I think that as well.
Yeah,
and also it's a case of, in many people's families and in many people's lives, their dogs are their family. You know, you wouldn't stop them. You know, if they had a daughter or a son and they were using the quilt, you wouldn't stop them using it. So just because it's a dog and that's what they class as family, I don't think it's right people object to it. But equally, I do understand, with the love and care that you put into it, you may not have tried quite so hard if it was something that was an animal was going to use later.
Well, the quilts were used for like 15 years, I think. I think they got their good use out of them. So the kids are quite old now. But I mean, I really don't mind what people do with a quilt. I mean, the very first quilt that I made was a sampler. And my mother was very, very kind. She was trying to get a mark out of it. And I don't know what she was thinking, but she used some bleach. And there's like white bleach marks on some of the blocks. But for me, you know, when it happened, I was a little bit upset. But after that, I just thought, well, you know, it's my first quilt that's just got a little bit of a history to it. Just gives me another reason to love my mother more, or to practice loving my mother more. But you know,
you and I, if we'd met years ago, Tracy, life may have been very different. I think I'm going to get that on a t-shirt. I should have practiced loving my mother more.
Oh dear, yeah.
Oh, I love it.
No, I was going to say, well, I'll go one step further, and I'm sure there are some dogs that appreciate the quilt more than some people. So I'd rather the dog sleep on it than some people.
For me, my biggest pet peeve is if I've spent the time and money and effort and energy making you a quilt, do not put it in the cupboard to gather dust. Use it. And if you use it to go and have picnics on, fine. Just make sure you're using it, because I made one for my brother and he found out how much it was worth. And I was like, because I was selling them on my website, and I said, for crying out loud, use the quilt. And he said, no, it's worth so much money. I said, no, it's not. Use it.
Yeah, that's, I think, is one of the saddest things people can do, is just put them in their closet and never use it. And I do know some people that have received quilts, and they're there in the closet, that's it. Years ago, it's not really quilt related, but I said, if you love me, you love my dog. So the dog won. So if the dog sleeps on the quilt, that's okay. You know?
I agree.
Yeah.
And I have to say, for all the ills that there are in the world, I still wake up every day dreaming of quilting. I go to bed at night thinking about quilts, and I spend most of my day in some form or another dealing with quilting. So for all there may be cons, I'm still involved and I'm still loving it every single day.
Yeah.
I'm so glad I'm not the only one.
Yeah.
You found your
thinks
people.
About yeah, I know. It's like there's something wrong with me. I mean, I wake up in the morning and just think, oh, I just can't wait to get home and quilt. Like, I can't wait to do this. I can't wait to do that. Like, I plan, you know, it's an affliction. I think once you start, you just cannot stop. I think this year, I definitely want to try and bend time a little bit more so that I can make more quilts. And I keep thinking about those 28 that you made in a month, and I'm like, yes, like that is something.
Look, I won't deny there were a lot of jelly rolls there, and I did cheat with one because I made the world's largest jelly roll race, and I think it was 250 inches by 70 inches, and then I cut it down to 3 quilts, and that worked fine for me because it was all Easter colors. So I had a black one. The way the fabric went is I had a hugely dark one, and then I had a dark and a light one, and then a massively light one on the other end, which was perfect because I've got 3 totally different colored quilts for Easter.
I think that's genius. I mean, isn't that just great? I love the way people think differently. It's brilliant.
But I used a lot of fabric, and I think that was the main thing for me, was being able to know I needed to have that make or break moment where it was, this is either going to be something that I'm going to do and love, or it's going to be something that it's a phase and I'm moving on from. And I think that time, oh my goodness. And it was so silly because I put this out into the world on my little Facebook page, and some complete stranger, to this day, I still don't know her name. I can't remember her name. And she messaged me privately to say, oh, you'll never do that. And I thought, oh, some strangers told me I won't do something. Watch this space, Missy. Because it was supposed to do 25 quilt tops in 30 days because I wanted to have one day off a week. And I did 28. I did 28 quilts in 28 days.
Yeah,
and
it was crazy.
Yeah.
And I can assure you, a lot of the points did not match, and I didn't care. But it was just so lovely to be able to have them. And I use a lot of them in my talks now to show people how awful they were and how it doesn't matter because you've done it and you've made them.
Yeah, it doesn't matter because they're what you've made. And if you love them, then yeah.
But it's part of your journey as well.
And if beauty's, what's the saying? Beauty's in the eye of the beholder.
Yep.
So what one person thinks is ugly, you'll see it as beauty, and you'll see the beauty in it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So Tracy, have you got anything to end off with?
No, I think we've covered it all, and I mean, we can talk forever on this subject, and I think we've done very well. And there's lots of points we didn't touch, but it'll all come.
And I will say one thing before we hand over to Tracy B for her finale. I'm going to just say Pinterest. If and when you start looking at Pinterest, set your phone timer for 15 minutes. And in 15 minutes time, if you've opened your Pinterest to look for a star quilt, and you're currently looking at a mushroom risotto recipe and a walled garden, and you're currently then also looking at a living wall that you can't live without, it's time to step away from Pinterest if after 15 minutes you've not found what you're looking for.
That is an incredible rabbit hole to go down.
It is, but we all do it. And we all love it.
Yeah. It is an amazing source of inspiration, and it covers everything, like everything you can think of. It's amazing.
But the mushroom risotto recipe, I don't even like mushrooms, and I've saved the mushroom risotto recipe because it looks so
Looks so yum. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm just so glad I'm not the only one that does that. But the good idea, John, 15 minutes of Pinterest is an excellent idea.
I will put a caveat on that, is if after 15 minutes you are still looking at star quilt patterns, set yourself another 15 minutes because you're back on track.
Yeah. Well, I don't have anything else to add. I know when you said, like, what are the bad things about quilting? I was like, oh, I don't even know if I have any of those. But yeah, I think that the good by far outweighs the bad, and all the fabulous highlights have always been good ones. You know, I don't remember when I've cut fabric wrong or I don't remember those. I just remember how beautiful the quilt was, how happy the recipient was to get it, and like, oh, I'm busy with the memory quilt at the moment that is very long overdue, and I'm trying to plan how I'm going to present it to her. So it's, you know, that for me is just the funnest part about the whole thing, is the planning and the joy of handing a quilt over to someone that you know will appreciate it.
Well, and I think the bad moments in quilting has taught us to laugh at ourselves. Like when going back to saying sewing with no bobbin, well, you kind of have a little laugh and carry on, right? Because so I think that's a good thing too.
It is.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Love it. So next week we are going to be back, and we are going to be talking fabric designers and fabric choices and things. So until then, I am going to say from a very, very cold Buckinghamshire, au revoir, good night, enjoy your evening. Tracy A, have you got anything to end with?
No, thank you. I can't wait till next week and talk about designers, and this has been fun, and I just want to say thank you for inviting me along this wonderful podcast journey. It's fun.
You're very welcome. I think the two of you are fabulous. So Tracy B, you going to say au revoir from Cape Town?
Goeienacht, allemaal. Slaap goed. There you go.
Lekker
nice
slaap.
Afrikaans. Lekker slaap. Ta-da.
Have a great evening, and we'll see you all back next week.
Fantastic. Thanks, John, for getting us together. This is so much fun. Oh, my word.
Pleasure, ladies. You look after yourselves, and we'll catch up next week. All of you out there, thanks so much for joining us. We'll be back again next week when we're talking fabric designers. Go well. Bye-bye.